Well, I think we have already more than 20 participants, so I think we'll start the webinar. So welcome to all of you. We're really pleased to welcome you today for this online webinar on diaspora response to humanitarian emergencies in Pakistan, Somalia, and Ukraine. This online conference will be facilitated by Alexandra Singh-Piel and myself, Rafael Caponi. We are both the coordinators of the DEMAC initiative. And I will let Alexandra introduce the content of the webinar with the agenda and also the different rules we will use to make you participate actively in this online conference. Welcome, Alexandra.
Thanks a lot, Rafael, and welcome everyone. We are very happy to have you here and looking forward to having a nice discussion with you over the next 2 hours. To quickly run you through the agenda and what is expecting you today, we first very shortly will share some few sentences about DEMAC, the vision and the objectives. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but a quick reminder, and also to everyone who is new to DEMAC, we'd like to share a few sentences and then directly go into the case study overview. So share key findings and recommendations from the 3 case studies we have conducted. Followed by a bit more in-depth presentation of the country-specific findings. So we'll have dedicated presentations on Pakistan, Ukraine, and Somalia, and have also, that's important, after each of these presentations, 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers. So don't wait for the very end of the webinar, but shoot us your questions right away. And we'll be happy to answer them throughout the next hours. How can you do that? To participate, you can please type your questions in the Q&A button, not the chat. You will see on the slide at the very bottom, you have a Q&A symbol where you can type in your questions, where we will also see them. You can also vote on other people's questions if you agree with them and if you want to have them highlighted. So we will see them, we will pick them up in the question and answer sessions, but please don't put them in the chat as the function of Q&A is really much more helpful for that. You can also, if you are following us on Facebook Live, you can also type your questions there. We will also monitor that and pick those questions up. And we are live on Facebook, so you can also watch the session there and share it with interested friends and colleagues. Our Facebook page, you see it there on the screen as well. So there's plenty of time and plenty of ways to participate, and we really look forward to all of your questions. If we are not able to answer all of them, bear with us, and we only have 2 hours, but we'll do our best to try and answer as many as possible there. A few sentences about DEMAC. It's a global initiative and stands for Diaspora Emergency Action and Coordination. It's currently hosted by the Danish Refugee Council and funded by USAID, the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, until next year summer. And it's already been established many years ago in 2015, initially funded by DG ECHO and Danida. And what DEMAC aims at, what is DEMAC's mission? DEMAC wants to enable inclusive coordination and collaboration across diaspora organizations and humanitarian institutions and facilitate a higher level of engagement and visibility for diaspora organizations in the humanitarian system. So trying to bridge and trying to bring together the humanitarian diaspora organizations with the humanitarian system and institutional humanitarian actors. DEMAC's objectives and what we are doing right now in this current phase and in this and next year is first trying to enhance knowledge between diasporas and humanitarian institutions. So part of this is the case studies we have been conducting, and we are sharing the findings with you today. Secondly, we want to increase awareness on diaspora humanitarian interventions. So we are running a series of workshops with diaspora organizations, with institutional humanitarian actors in different countries, and peer-to-peer workshops with different diasporas from all over the world to really increase this awareness and make sure people know what diaspora organizations do in humanitarian responses. And ultimately, we'll try to improve coordination communication and coherence of the humanitarian response by developing frameworks and tools that will allow to go really to have a global approach to how diaspora organizations can engage in humanitarian responses with humanitarian actors across the world in different contexts. I hand over to Raphael to give you a bit more of his overview on the different case studies and how our research was conducted.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for this introduction. Yes, so before we dive into the finding of the case studies, we would like to explain a little bit the purpose of them. I think maybe we could have the screen being shared again so that we can see the contents. So the aim of the case studies are, I mean, really it's a research study on diaspora humanitarian response. And the objective is really to look at the modalities of intervention of diaspora organization, as well as their engagement with institutional humanitarian actors in the 3 focus countries, so Pakistan, Somalia, and Ukraine, which are very different contexts. So really interesting also to see these differences between the modalities of intervention and the coordination and the engagement. One of the purposes as well of the case studies is to look into recommendation for improve coordination or enhance cooperation and synergies between diaspora organization and the institutional humanitarian actors. The research was carried out by 5 researchers and consultants who are here with us today, who all work for ONeill Consulting. So the 2 main lead researchers will present the main findings that are across the case study, the 3 countries, and the consultant that were in country will focus specifically on the country findings. If we look at the content of the case studies, we look at the profile of the diaspora organization, their setup, the status they have, the way they operate. We look also at their motivation in terms of engagement in the humanitarian response. What is their motivation, but also the purpose of their assistance. We look at the nature of the assistance as well, in terms of sectors, in terms of area of intervention, in terms of location. And we also look at coordination and implementation. Is there coordination between diaspora organization with the humanitarian institutional system? And if yes, how does it happen? We look also at financing for humanitarian response. Is the funding of diaspora organization ultimately coming from the diaspora network, or is there other source of funding as well, from NGO, from UN agencies, from donors, etc. We also look at the way diaspora organizations select their beneficiaries, how they plan, how they target, how they their selection criteria as well. And finally, we also look at the gap and challenges, and we came up with this recommendation that I was mentioning on the future of diaspora humanitarian response. In terms of methodology, we started with a mapping, with a desk review, mapping of diaspora organization active in the 3 countries. And then we had a focal point in each country doing interviews. Because of the COVID situation, it was mostly online. But we did try to have a broad range of actors being interviewed. So not only diaspora organization representative, but also their partner on the ground, if they have any government representative, UN agency, NGOs, etc. All the relevant actors that for this research. So this is the presentation of the content of the case study. So now we'll dive into the findings. So I will introduce the first 2 speakers. Glenn ONeill and Lois Austin. So we can actually share the presentation again directly, so that when I introduce them. So Glenn ONeill has over 25 years of experience in the humanitarian sector with a specific focus on research and evaluation. He was involved in more than 100 evaluation and research projects in over 60 countries in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. He holds also a PhD in social research and methodology and an executive master in communication management. The second speaker is Lois Austin, with over 20 years of experience in the humanitarian sector. Lois has worked for a range of field-based and headquarter positions for different UN agency, NGO, the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. Lois managed and provided technical input to a range of humanitarian and protection program, and focusing on conflicts and disaster affected population in a number of complex environments. So Lois and Glenn, welcome, and the floor is yours for the presentation of the main findings.
Thank you very much, Raphael, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Before going into more detail over the 3 countries that we covered, which my colleagues will cover in a minute, I'm just going to run through some of the highlights of some of the areas where there were synergies and gaps that we found across the 3 contexts that we studied. So the case studies look primarily at 5 of the 6 areas that you can see on the screen in front of you, looking at the organizational structure of diaspora organizations, their humanitarian response, the sustainability of their humanitarian action, and also coordination between diaspora organizations themselves, as well as coordination with the institutional humanitarian system. The research did also consider issues related to accountability and adherence to humanitarian principles. My colleagues are going to talk a little bit further about the different organizational structures of diaspora organizations in the countries that we looked at, as there were different dominant types of structure seen in each country. And just to highlight that this diversity of structure can present a challenge when trying to define any form of generic framework or tools for engagement and coordination with the institutional humanitarian system. And similarly, my colleagues will talk about coordination between diaspora organizations, which differs from country to country. So I will start by highlighting the synergies that we found in relation to the findings on how diaspora organizations coordinate with the institutional humanitarian system. As can be seen from the slide in front of you, there's a variation across the countries studied, but also depending on the type and structure of the diaspora organization and who they partner with on the ground. So the research identified 3 main approaches to coordination, ranging from none at all to direct coordination by diaspora organizations with the institutional humanitarian system. And then there's that middle level, which primarily sees coordination through partners. Ukraine, for example, can be seen in the first type or the first level of coordination, where there's little or no coordination between diaspora organizations and institutional humanitarian actors. And at this level, diaspora organizations tended to link more directly with their partners on the ground. And if necessary, they would coordinate with local authorities or relevant bodies like medical institutions. Increased levels of coordination were seen in Pakistan, but again, not directly by the diaspora organizations themselves, rather through their partners. And this was particularly the case where diaspora organizations partnered with local and national NGOs who were already participating in humanitarian coordination mechanisms and structures. And then this final kind of 3rd level, where we saw examples of direct engagement and coordination. And we saw this in some cases in Pakistan and in Somalia, where diaspora organizations who had an in-country presence, so sometimes structures in country, were seen to coordinate with existing humanitarian coordination mechanisms. Next slide, please. So the next slide, the next issue that we will look at now is the response of diaspora organizations. And the key findings in relation to their humanitarian response covers a number of points. And these include that diaspora organization responses to humanitarian crises are often very swift in nature. It's different in each country, but many diaspora organizations provide longer term support to selected communities, for example, in education and healthcare. And when there's a new crisis or a spike in a crisis, they increase their support with more rapid humanitarian action, although this is often not linked to their ongoing work and is more focused on covering basic needs. In some situations, diaspora organizations have evolved from being created specifically to respond to a crisis, and this was seen in Ukraine, for example, to providing longer-term support focused on either specific geographic locations or specific sectors. The next area that we look at is the sustainability of diaspora humanitarian action. And it's actually been quite difficult to properly or robustly gauge the sustainability of diaspora humanitarian action, in part because, as Raphael mentioned, due to COVID-19 movement restrictions, all or most of the discussions that we held had to be undertaken remotely. So the research teams in the countries covered were unable to speak directly to those who are recipients of diaspora humanitarian support. But what we can say is that implementing more planned and sustainable humanitarian interventions is often challenging for diaspora organizations. And this is in part because their funding is unpredictable, with very few diaspora organizations accessing longer term institutional funding, although we did find some examples of this in Pakistan and Somalia. But really, the majority of diaspora organization financial resources are raised online and through crowdfunding and social media. And this means that their responses take place when sufficient funds are received, and that can be very difficult to predict or plan for. Next, just to look at accountability and humanitarian principles. All diaspora organizations covered in this research report report on their activities, often through Facebook or through their own websites, but there were limited, more structured approaches to accountability, either to donors or to recipients of assistance. When thinking about the recipients and the donor base, actually, this is in part due to the high levels of trust that exist between diaspora organizations, between those they're assisting and working with in country and their support base. Levels, can you hear me? Sorry, I think I
lost you
cut.
For 1 second, but you're back now.
Oh, okay, good. So maybe I'll just say what I said again, just to be clear that the lack of more structured accountability is often in part due to the high levels of trust that exist between diaspora organizations and those that they're assisting and working with in country. Levels of accountability and the existence of monitoring and feedback mechanisms are also influenced by their funding sources and the requirements of donors. A number of the diaspora organizations that we spoke to in this research were, though, open to receiving support in relation to accountability, including gaining a better understanding of the humanitarian principles, common humanitarian principles, and how they can be applied. There was a differing awareness of humanitarian principles by diaspora organizations and their partners, and also a different willingness or interest in applying humanitarian principles to their humanitarian action, and it varied from country to country. Perhaps a point to make, though, is that given the important role of business and religious leaders as intermediaries for diaspora organizations in a number of countries, that we looked at, it's important to consider how their awareness of humanitarian principles can be increased, possibly through the diaspora organizations and their partners. There are different understandings of accountability between diaspora organizations and institutional humanitarian actors, and this is something that needs to be recognized, particularly as trying to achieve much further alignment could be challenging. And certainly for DEMAC, a challenge relating to the application of humanitarian principles by diaspora organizations is how to create an understanding among institutional humanitarian actors that the fact that not all diaspora organizations share these principles shouldn't necessarily stand in the way of efforts to increase coordination and engagement. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Glenn, who will talk a little bit about some of the findings and recommendations that we made in relation to the future of diaspora humanitarian response. Thank you.
Thanks, Lois. Yes. So really, drawing from the 3 case studies some points on, okay, you know, what we could imagine is the future of disaster response. So certainly what comes out strong in the case is that, you know, in all contexts, informal humanitarian response will continue, you know, where there's direct links between communities in countries of residencies and their countries of origin. So this will certainly go on, and a lot of this, if you like, is relatively informal and remains, as we say, under the radar. At the same time, the diaspora organizations that are active in humanitarian response are becoming more visible. We could say also possibly more organized, and are becoming active players in humanitarian response. And as we'll hear in the case studies in some countries, we could say there's a part of the humanitarian system, for example, in Pakistan, where you have some diaspora organizations that are functioning virtually like, you know, NGOs, major NGOs in the country. Also, as Lois said, there are differences in understandings of humanitarian principles and humanitarian standards between diaspora organizations and the institutional actors. But at the same time, we found that there are opportunities for greater engagement between the institutional actors and the diaspora organizations in all of the countries. So these opportunities, of course, exist and have to be further developed and really seen on both sides. What is the interest of the diaspora organizations and what is the interest of the institutional humanitarian actors, which does differ from country to country, context to context. The case studies also are forward-looking in proposing a series of recommendations that are both country-specific, but there's also some recommendations that are general overall that apply to all of the countries and possibly other contexts. So just to talk a little bit about the general recommendations. Here you can see what we've done is basically here we have the recommendations put around the life cycle of humanitarian programming, so with the different stages. So firstly, if we look on the start, looking at the step of alerting and needs assessment here, certainly we thought that there could be more done to capitalize on the diaspora's organizations. You know, they have really a unique access to the community and integrate them better into, you know, needs assessments and alert systems. Also, if we go down to strategic planning, also here, certainly in the planning, in most cases of the institutional actors, the diaspora is relatively absent. So how can that be improved? And also, how can it have a better exchange and dialogue and capacity building and exchanges? Also to see where can a common ground be found on such issues of humanitarian principles and standards. Also on resources, this also the notion of how can countries, you know, better facilitate and support the transfer of diaspora funds. This, of course, is an ongoing issue of transferring funds between countries, which I'm sure most people are aware of. And also, is there a role for donor governments to, you know, set up more matching funds? Is that possible? And if we go up on implementation, also, yes. Is it possible to develop more partnerships for implementation, encourage exchanges? Also because the diaspora organizations, as we'll hear in the case studies, have different ways of implementation. So it's interesting to see how can they also learn from each other and also learn from the other humanitarian actors. In peer review and evaluation, also, which is the next point above, in terms of looking how can diaspora organizations be involved in joint assessments and reviews. They can bring their know-how and their knowledge, and also, as we heard just from Lois, you know, to have exchanges on the different ways and approaches for feedback and accountability. And then in the center, we have coordination and information management. So here is this more in the question of coordination, which comes up, as you heard from Lois, there's different layers and levels of coordination. So basically, in general, how can that be improved and greater involvement? And lastly, on information management, diaspora organizations are producing quite a lot of information. Quite a lot of it, of course, is from a unique perspective and really from the community. So how can that be better integrated into the existing humanitarian information channels? So on these points, on these recommendations, this concludes the overall presentation of the findings on synergies and differences. And I think we're just going to pause now for some questions before we really dive into the case studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn and Lois, for this really clear and interesting presentation. It was super interesting for us. So we're moving now to our Q&A session. So we have 10 minutes for a few questions related to your presentation and the synergies across the three case studies. So the first question we have is that we often hear from institutional humanitarian actors that Diaspora organizations do not have significant capacities, and also that they are politicized or that do not respect humanitarian principle. So we were interested to hear if this is something the research and the finding of the case studies has confirmed, or is it something that did you came up with different findings on these topics?
Raphael, I can take that one. I mean, I think there's two different points there, and one is about the capacity of diaspora organizations, and the other is potentially more about politicization and respect of humanitarian principles. And I think we'll hear a bit from Guhad, Niloufar and Dina from the different countries that we looked at on both these points potentially. I think in relation to this thinking that diaspora organizations don't have significant capacity to respond, I think we can see that in all the countries covered that there isn't necessarily a finding that supports that. The capacities vary depending on the size and structure of the diaspora organizations, but also it's linked to how long they've been active, and across all three countries we see organizations with incredibly long histories of being involved in diaspora action, and linked to their capacity as well. What we did find was the speed of their response when there's either a spike in a crisis or a new rapid onset humanitarian crisis is the ability to transfer funds very rapidly from countries of residence to the crisis country. And that's also linked in part to what was mentioned previously about the less structured accountability, because it's very easy for diaspora, or much easier for diaspora organizations to quickly transfer funds and implement rapid responses in a way that institutional humanitarian actors often struggle with. And again, that's linked to the connections that diaspora organizations have with affected communities, which again are often strong and pre-existing crisis. In relation to the humanitarian principles, I think in some countries there was a politicization, and there was a lack of respect or adherence to humanitarian principles. But and we could maybe suggest that Ukraine is one of those, but it's very open and a very clear objective to assist in the way that actually the diaspora organization donor base want the assistance to be provided. But that certainly wasn't seen in all assistance, and certainly not across all countries. Maybe perhaps it's not about a willingness to apply humanitarian principles, but about a knowledge of humanitarian principles and having a stronger awareness of those principles, and how institutional humanitarian actors, diaspora organizations and their partners on the ground can work together to increase that knowledge, so that adherence and application of humanitarian principles is less of a struggle. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting points you raised there. And I see we have some questions coming up already, and I think there's a very interesting one on the how would you recommend beginning to build relationships between the institutional humanitarian actors and diaspora organizations. I think it touches a little bit on the potentially the vetting and the due diligence, but also what would be needed potentially to kickstart this relationship building. Is it a lack of capacity? Is it do the humanitarian system and diaspora organizations know of each other? Like, what would you recommend? How can we really build this relationship and start building this between the different systems? don't know if Glenn or Lois, one of you has an answer on that.
Okay, I can take that. I mean, I think actually this research is hopefully already a beginning or a continuation of relationship building that's already started under DEMAC. And, you know, there have already been some tentative links made between institutional humanitarian actors and diaspora organizations. I think capacity is an issue for both of those organizations or entities. I mean, a number of diaspora organizations that we've spoken to in all three countries are not necessarily staffed by paid staff. They're staffed by volunteers, both in the countries of residence and countries of operation. And so there is a capacity issue in terms of reaching out to the international humanitarian actors in country, and also a question marks over the actual need for that, because what's the benefit for diaspora organizations themselves? From the institutional humanitarian actors, I mean, I would say that capacity is also an issue. For us, it was a struggle to find a key person who would be tasked with that role of connecting and engaging and coordinating with diaspora organizations. No particular focal point, and that also would be something that could be considered, so that actually there is a very clear link as to who can be connected with and how communication can at least start. Over.
Thank you very much, Lois. That's really really interesting, and yeah, as you said, I think very well. This is something DEMAC is also trying to work on, and there is some degrees of coordination already happening, but there's also a lot of space for increased synergies and collaboration. So I think a lot of this come up in the case study in a very clear way. But thank you so much for this answer. We have a lot of very interesting questions coming up in the chat. We still have 2 minutes, so I'll ask one more. So from the presentation, it looks like diaspora organizations have a high level of trust with the affected community, and this is indeed something that came up strongly in the case studies. So the question is this something institutional humanitarian actors could learn from and learn from diaspora organizations, this trust and this with affected community? Maybe Glenn has an issue with the microphone.
I think Glenn's got an issue with something technical, so I will. Sorry to hear my voice again. And I think again, Dina and Guhad and Niloufar can again speak to this from the specific country perspectives. But I would definitely say that the learning is two-way, and for sure the institutional humanitarian system and different actors and agencies within that could learn about those very sort of grassroots levels of communication and building up trust. And I mean, in all the countries covered, there are obviously local and national partners that are worked with both by diaspora organizations and by institutional humanitarian actors. And I would say they would also be absolutely critical in this learning process. Over.
Thank you very much, Lois. That's really insightful. Alexandra, do you have any additional question you would like to ask?
I see a lot of interesting questions in the chat. So
we're running out of time. Maybe we can have one last one, maybe. Or
yeah, maybe we can look at the commonalities of diaspora organizations. And did you find where diaspora organizations, when linking up with local or national NGOs, what are the enabling factors you see there, and what really best enhances this? Is there anything that you came across in all the three countries, or?
In linking with local and national NGOs, I don't know that there was a commonality actually across the studies. And I think there are also different interpretations in each country as to even what is a local or national NGO. And if I think about Ukraine, for example, what might be called an NGO who is a partner of a diaspora organization wouldn't necessarily be a humanitarian NGO, actually. It might be an active organization that is registered as a charity, but is more facilitating logistics and the import of humanitarian goods, for example. But we didn't see that in the other two countries. So I think there were not that many similarities across the countries in terms of those kind of connections over.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, and thanks a lot to everyone who has been putting in questions. We will have more time to come back to those throughout the next hour, and we'll make sure to answer as many as possible. I would like to move on to the specific case studies and the countries presentations, because I think there's also a lot of interesting findings to go a bit deeper into. And we'll start with Pakistan. So let me quickly introduce Niloufar Shahzad, who has been the researcher in Pakistan and has been supporting us there she has 17 years of experience in Pakistan with different national, international NGOs in a range of capacities, and has been conducting evaluations and impact assessments on large-scale humanitarian and development programs, and has a master's degree in humanitarian action, development practice, and Urdu literature. So thanks a lot for supporting us with this research, Niloufar. And over to you to show us some interesting findings you have from Pakistan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Good afternoon, good evening all, and thanks to the DEMAC and research team for giving us this opportunity to be part of this presentation and present findings of our respective countries. Yeah. Talking about Pakistan, I must say that the case of Pakistan is unique. Unique in a sense that the country, despite having huge potential, is among the most prone countries to disaster in the South Asia region. And unfortunately, in the past couple of decades, the country witnessed major disasters where the disasters, I mean, there are always two sides. So on one hand, the disaster highlighted structural inabilities and weaknesses of the government institutions. But on the other hand, they offered opportunities for international cooperation, and evolution of cluster system post-earthquake 2005 is one such example. Alongside institutional humanitarian actors, the disaster responses also highlighted that the Pakistani diaspora are among the first one to respond generously, especially during disaster time. And this phenomena was observed after earthquake 2005 and later during IDP crisis of Malakand and flood responses. But the diaspora support, unfortunately, support has not been consistent nor documented. But I'm glad that today we are discussing the role of diaspora in humanitarian responses. And I am sure that this certainly brings the importance of role these diaspora play in the limelight. During the research, some of the key trends which we observe for Pakistan are that not necessarily that the diaspora organizations are created as a humanitarian response organization, but the trends among almost all of them shows that whatever their original reason for existence was, majority of the identified diaspora organizations scaled up their interventions during humanitarian crisis. Like even if they were previously engaged in the development sort of work, but whenever any crisis hit the country, they sort of like shifted their interest from that development initiative to that immediate need. Another major trend is that around half or even slightly high number of the diaspora organization have registered their organization in the Pakistan. For example, they are registered in the countries abroad, and then they have their chapter registered in Pakistan. Few of the example of Human Development Foundation, Citizen Foundation, Development in Literacy, which is working in education primarily, Penny Appeal, Swat Relief Initiative, etc., and many more. So they are registered abroad and are as well as in Pakistan, and they are also self-implementing the activities and sometimes with the partners as well. Likewise, there are other diaspora organizations who work with local partners. One of such example is Pakistan Dubai Association, which is supporting a local initiative of school and orphanage with the titled Parvarish, with the name of Parvarish. Another interesting trend in Pakistan is that that though not all diaspora organizations are participating in the coordination mechanism, the more formal diaspora organization, for example, HDF, this Human Development Foundation, Citizen Foundation, DIL and Penny Appeal and SRI, etc., are part and parcel of the coordination mechanism. In one way or another, they are connected. And are part of the coordination mechanisms at national, local, or district, provincial or district level. So in the context of Pakistan, another trend which we observe is that where diaspora organizations are largely accepted, the more formal organizations are recognized as local traditional humanitarian actors and not diaspora organizations. So they are known to the people, but as an humanitarian organization, not as an diaspora organizations. And similarly, mechanisms such as financial tracking system of UN systems also don't bifurcate their contribution as diaspora contributions. So yeah, these are some of the major trends which we observed during the Pakistan case study. Some of the profiles and areas of intervention of the Pakistani diaspora are, so there are different type of Pakistani diaspora organizations. Some are formally structured, other are more of professional associations, such as like doctors or engineers set up the association, and then they are working, the doctors and the engineers back in their country, in Pakistan, while there are some informal group as well. It is seen that majority of the diaspora organizations are registered charities abroad and in Pakistan with proper systems, staffing, volunteers, and governance structure. They have their governing bodies and they have a lot of volunteers on ground who are working for them. Some do have even registered offices in more than one countries abroad. So for example, development in literacy have affiliate offices in US, UK, Canada, etc. These affiliate do some fundraising, while Development Literacy Pakistan specifically implement the programs on the ground in Pakistan. Likewise, some Pakistani diaspora also provide assistance in country other than Pakistan. It was a very sort of interesting finding for us as well, that some of them are quite active, and like ED Foundation, Minhajul Quran, who has provided assistance in Syria, Libya, etc. And even in the recent pandemic, when now India is, the situation in India is critical and it's getting out of control, the ED Foundation Pakistan offered services to the government of India, and they offered huge fleet of ambulances and health providers. I'm not aware if India accepted this or not, but it was appreciated. Similarly, it is evident from the graph that the DOs have implementing progress across different sectors. So they are active in a wide range of thematic areas, from education, health, food security, and livelihood. Most of them are active in WASH and economic development, livelihood restorations. Worth mentioning that it is also observed that different diaspora organizations also implement programs in more than one sectors. Even some were found doing work in more than 3 or 4 thematic areas, ranging from women empowerment to WASH and health activities. Yeah, moving to the next slide. So in this, amid COVID, unfortunate pandemic of COVID response, Diaspora organizations were quite active. Some of the examples are like a SWAT Relief Initiative is a US-based do, and it has registered in SWAT region of KPK, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So on the onset of COVID, they started their awareness raising activities to combat the spread of COVID-19. And they also provided support to over 5,000 families with food and non-food items. And the support for non-food item was mainly like provision of hygiene and other wash and FI. Likewise, the Citizen Foundation mostly provided cash assistance to the affected population across the country, and they benefited some 45,000 households. They also provided personal protection kits, some 20,000 in number, to 34 health facilities across the country. Human Development Foundation, another diaspora organization registered in United States of America, has been implementing multi-sectoral programs in Pakistan. In the current pandemic situation, they provided meals, cooked meals to thousands of families in all the three provinces of Pakistan. Support to the poor, it's a unique initiative among the identified diaspora organizations. This is a group created by local activists who are based in Pakistan, but realizing the potential of their fellow villagers who are working abroad and mainly based in Middle Eastern region, they created this group. Families in the, so they created this group in 2015 when the northern areas of Pakistan were hit by the earthquake, and and some specifically in the village of Islampur, many were left without shelter. At that time, the villager abroad provided assistance mainly through their relatives. And now when the COVID happened, the local activists formalized the group again, and they are very active on the WhatsApp. They formed a group there, and they help mobilize more resources. And as a result, they provided some, supported some 400 families with food rations. Hope Charity is a smallish initiative, but doing good things. They provided support for food, clothes, and school uniforms during this pandemic. Penny Appeal is registered both in UK and Pakistan, and it's provided assistance directly as well as through local partners. In Swat region, the Penny Appeal work with a local NGO, Environmental Protection Society, which is otherwise very active in development work, but also on need basis, they respond to the humanitarian crisis. So they provided them winterized kits to the COVID affected vulnerable families. Similarly, the Penny Appeal has provided assistance to flood affected population in Sindh, and they provided some wash facilities and food assistance. Yeah, so this was a short overview from the case study of Pakistan, and I would be happy to take if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Nilüfer. I think that was really interesting and really valuable insights for the research. I was wondering if you could touch more on one point. You already mentioned that, for example, large diaspora organizations such as the Citizens Foundations, which we've just seen in the examples, provided assistance to more than 45,000 households across Pakistan, which is quite a large number. That even those organizations sometimes are not recognized as diaspora organizations, but rather as local or national NGOs in Pakistan. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit more what challenges come out of that, and what did the diaspora organizations, when you interviewed them, or also the humanitarian sites, what did they explain on this? What can be the tricky parts with not being recognized as diaspora, if any? Or are they happy about that in the end?
Yeah, no, Alexandra, thank you so much for asking this question. Yeah, I mean, it's very true. To a large extent, this is the understanding that major diaspora organizations such as the Citizen Foundation, Human Development Foundation, Development in Literacy, and Penny Appeal, to name few, are operating more of a pattern of traditional humanitarian actors. And hence they are considered or treated as a national local NGOs instead of the diaspora organization. So part of this explanation can be that these diaspora organizations also receive funds from other sources, like other than the diaspora communities. Secondly, they seem to be fully integrated in the humanitarian system. So they are part of the cluster mechanism. This somehow overshadow their existence as the dues. Secondly, even if they receive considerable chunks of their resources from Pakistani diaspora through their offices abroad, this is not reflected in the financial tracking systems as dues support. So this means that diaspora support humanitarian responses, though it is not reflected in the formal humanitarian system. So yeah, somehow, I mean, talking to them, they were not, I mean, they acknowledged their identity of diaspora support, but still, I mean, they are happy with the current arrangement as well. But talking from the personal point of view, I mean, giving them more visibility as a diaspora organization will encourage more diaspora organization. And I mean, it should be encouraged because they are playing a significant role, and most of their resources are coming from the diaspora communities. So why not?
Thank you so much, Niloufar. That's really interesting. I think it's really a key finding of the case studies to really see that some Pakistani diaspora organizations have a very strong capacity and they have a very large scale program. And they are coordinating with the humanitarian system, but they are not recognized as diaspora organization. And a lot of their funding that they receive from the diaspora communities is also not captured as such. So, so it's really interesting, and I think this is something that could feed into our following workshop and discussion. So thank you so much. We do have a follow-up question as well on the specificity of Pakistani diaspora organization. From your perspective, what could be the strengths of Pakistani DO compared to a standard international NGO?
Okay, so one of the very interesting phenomena is that like they mobilize resource immediately, particularly in the wake of any emergency situation. So they were quick. And their quick responses, as they may not need to follow the cumbersome procurement processes, which is very common for the sort of structured humanitarian actors. And this is particularly true in the case of informal diaspora organization. They have the edge that they have a strong local trust, and they access as an independent actor. They have direct contacts with affected communities. Their access is better, minimize overhead cost and maximize aid because they are not spending a lot on the administrative stuffs and the staff. Sustainability with the longer term support provided. Example is the SWAT relief initiative. They have less or no reporting requirements. So this is both like plus and minus. Plus in a sense that like the resources are utilized for assistance mainly with no or limited overhead cost. Negative is in a sense that it may lead to a transparency and accountability issues. Yeah, these are few. So yeah, they often provide assistance in their own communities, and hence they know that who is in dire need and in of intended assistance. So, but it also has the flip side. I mean, that can be that there is a chance that the assistance is provided based on personal biases, likes and dislikes, and not purely on based on need. So yeah.
That's really interesting, Niloufar. Thank you so much. I think, Alexandra, you have another question.
I just see that also Paul has put one in the question and answers, so maybe I'll give that first. He would like to know what. Let me quickly read that before I read it out loud. what would support Pakistani diaspora groups to engage with Pakistani national and local authorities in their humanitarian and philanthropic activities? So how can we support the Pakistani DOs to engage with authorities in their activities as well?
So I would say that like capacity enhancement, I would not say capacity development, because there are already a lot of capacity. So capacity enhancement, because in Pakistan, I mean, organization have to pass through this cumbersome process of registering with EAD, keeping in mind this terrorist financing and things. So it's like a lot of administrative support is requirement, and a lot of documentation they need. So some of the even the small local organization find it very difficult to go through and follow all this process. So I would say that like investing on their capacity so that they can better equip themselves to comply with the existence exhausting list of the government, so that they can better intervene in the system. Because I mean, it's not an easy, keeping in mind the scenario of Pakistan and the context of Pakistan, it's really a very daunting task of sending the money direct to them, and it needs a lot of like check and things. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Mufa. That's really interesting. Maybe I would just add that one of the findings was actually that Pakistan, between the three countries, was the one where we saw the highest number of diaspora organizations having an office registered in country. So there is actually in Pakistan quite a high level of engagement with local authorities, but also with the institutional humanitarian system, because there is, I think, this strong involvement also of the government and request to have offices in country, and also because we see a lot of robust, large Pakistani diaspora organizations who have offices also in country. But thank you so much, Neelofar, and also for joining us so late from Pakistan. Thank you so much. We'll now move on to Ukraine for the presentation. So I will introduce our next speaker, Dina Volinet. So Dina Volinet was focusing on Ukraine case study. She was in country during the whole process and was conducting all the interview in Ukraine. And Dina is a social change strategist, analyst, and consultant. And she has 13 years of experience in governance, civil society, community development, and humanitarian projects in Belarus and Ukraine. So we're really pleased to welcome you, Dina, today, and we're looking forward for your presentation of the main finding of the case study in Ukraine. Over to you.
Thank you, Raphael, and good time of the day, everyone. I would like to start maybe about talking about Ukraine diaspora a little bit, few words, because Ukraine diaspora has a long history. Official records go back to 18th century, and the largest and oldest communities of Ukrainians reside in Russian Federation, Canada, and USA. And as in the focus of the research lied the diaspora organizations that had been performing humanitarian activities more than once or systematically. All the analysis provided here covers so-called humanitarian diaspora organizations and not diaspora community in general. Just take this in mind. So what was interesting is to find that the main motivation for humanitarian response for Ukrainian diaspora organizations was the wish to preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine, driven by patriotism and empathy for fellow Ukrainians. This is why the majority of diaspora organizations support the families and children of killed or wounded soldiers, and or support directly the military, and consider this support as humanitarian. So if you ask them, are you providing humanitarian aid? They would say yes, and they would mean that they help military, for example. Why is that so? This had a background connected to the USSR. Ukraine, or so-called Ukrainian Soviet Republic at the time, used to receive some clothes, toys, and stationery for children living in Chernobyl-affected territories. and this was called the humanitarian aid. And since then, everything that is provided free of charge is called humanitarian, no matter who is the recipient. So that's one peculiarity for Ukraine. Diaspora organizations mostly implement activities through local NGOs or directly themselves, despite the fact that they don't have local representatives or local offices in Ukraine. And they keep doing so just because they receive requests directly from their beneficiaries, and they think it is faster and more efficient if they work that way. Although diaspora organizations coordinate with local authorities, communities, and medical institutions, there is limited coordination with institutional humanitarian actors in Ukraine, as we found out. Only those organizations that are part of humanitarian systems already coordinate with diaspora, but mainly these organizations are part of international networks, NGOs such as Caritas or ADRA. They have their offices in different countries and they coordinate by themselves, apply for internal grants, but no other examples have been found. When we analyze humanitarian diaspora organizations in Ukraine, we have identified that there are more or less three profiles or types of these organizations. First, the formal diaspora organizations, which provided humanitarian assistance prior to 2014 and continue to do so. So some of them exist since more than 50 years, and they represent people that can already call them local residents, as they are second or even third generation of Ukrainian living abroad. Some of them have never visited Ukraine even. Second one is diaspora organizations that started providing humanitarian assistance after 2015 and continue to do so on a project by project basis. Usually these organizations represent first generation of middle-class immigrants or expats that's still planning to come back to Ukraine. And the third one is less formal diaspora groups that started providing humanitarian assistance after 2014 and have now shifted their focus to other areas, such as culture, veteran support, advocacy, just because they see no point or they have no resource for providing humanitarian support. The difference between the second and the third is basically what they do now. They started maybe in a similar way, but now some of them focused on humanitarian assistance and some shifted their focus. So main areas of intervention, as you can see from the graph, is health, food security and livelihoods, education, economic development, and shelter. It's interesting that you wouldn't see almost any organization that would focus on only one area of intervention. Most of them combine these just because they are too complex and have different focuses and different projects going on. Talking about recent diaspora response in 2020 and 2021, you can see many of these organizations been helping Ukrainian medical institutions in terms of the COVID-19 response. If we also talk about these 2 years, we can also see that they are not focusing on conflict-affected territories only, which is Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. They also help other regions. For example, in December 20, Nova Ukraine provided equipment to a hospital for wounded veterans in Rivne Oblast, which is in the north. In July, August 2020, United Ukrainian American Relief Committee raised nearly 58,000 for financial assistance to the victims of flood in Western Ukraine. And these floods are actually seasonal. So many organizations are involved in this kind of humanitarian assistance in spring and autumn when the floods taking place. In March 2021, Ukrainian World Congress Latvia branch coordinated shipment of humanitarian cargo to Ukraine containing supplies for medical and social institutions. And that's actually the most common type of help in the recent years. In January 2021, a shipping container with humanitarian aid for hospitals for COVID-19 response was delivered from the USA to Odessa by the Support Hospitals in Ukraine. Support Hospitals in Ukraine is quite interesting organization as it is not an organization per se, it's a project. They work closely with American project called Cure that actually mobilizes the used medical equipment and help other countries get it and continue using it, for example, in Ukraine for more than 10 years, for example. Also, the shipping took like 6 months from the first request and to the moment when it was shipped to Odessa. So it took a long time. And what's interesting is that part of it was covered by local businesses located in Ukraine in Odessa, and part of them were covered by diaspora organizations from US. In February 2021, Razum for Ukraine coordinated with local NGO to support the renovation of a school library in Donetsk Oblast with a local NGO called BUR, Building Ukrainian Together. And this is an initiative that helped a lot in terms of renovation of shelter in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast for 7 years already. And in February 2021, Diaspora Ukraine, which is registered in Denmark, shipped 9 tons of medical equipment and supplies to Donetsk Oblast. Diaspora Ukraine also works with hospitals in Denmark and local organizations in Denmark to provide this support. I would say that this concludes my brief presentation, and if you have some questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Dina. That was really interesting and insightful. We do have already a few questions coming up, so I'll address them to you directly. So the first one is actually on coordination. It looks like Ukraine, among the 3 countries studied, was the one where we saw the least coordination between diaspora organization and the institutional humanitarian actors. And it would be interesting to hear from you what explained the situation and how you would explain that.
I would say that happened, and the explanation is linked to history. If you look through the NGO Sustainability Index reports, for example, that you say repeating every year, before 2014, Ukraine had quite strong civil society, especially in terms of advocacy and capacity building. However, before 2014, there weren't any professional humanitarian organizations except for the Red Cross, I would say, that existed since USSR. Since gaining its independence in 1991, Ukraine simply didn't need any humanitarian actions except for these seasonal floods repeating every year. And to make a long story short, not many people knew what is humanitarian assistance in classic. And another thing is that most of the diaspora organizations that now we call humanitarian were formed and activated not because of the conflict, but because of the revolution of dignity, which we call Maidan, which happened in 2013 and was prior to the conflict. Meaning they started to support protesters, then they focused on support to military, and then they shifted to humanitarian support. So their system was based on what Ukraine actually needed. Taking this fact into account, you may find out that some diaspora organizations heard about humanitarian system a year or even 2 years after they had been formed. And at the moment, they had no need to change the modality of their operation. So they simply didn't know, they weren't aware about it.
Very well. Thank you, Dina. That's really interesting. And maybe just to complement what you said, there is also the fact that compared to the other context, Ukraine is where we saw the youngest diaspora organization in terms of number of years of existence. And also in terms of structure, we saw that they were mostly run by volunteers. And we saw maybe in Pakistan and Somalia, they were a little bit more structured organization with the status of NGOs and offices in country and so on. But yeah, I think it was really very well put it on your side. I'll hand over to Alexandra for the next question.
Thanks. I think we had one interesting question in the chat, and I think I'll give it to Dina first, but maybe Lois then also wants to complement beyond Ukraine. And I think Yassin asked earlier already, like, if we included in our research the humanitarian response mechanisms in areas controlled by insurgencies in the respective countries or governments. So I think that is very interesting in the context of Ukraine, but potentially also on the other two cases we have. So maybe Dina, you want to answer that first?
Just to make it clearly, like the government control area and non-government control area, right?
Exactly.
So coming back to what I said previously, Ukraine, I wouldn't say it's politicized, but I would say just because Ukrainian humanitarian aid is motivated by the feeling of patriotism and empathy to fellow Ukrainians, not many organizations help or try to help, as they call the other side. But there's also another point to this, particularly in Ukraine. There are some official and not official laws that actually would say that if you're from Ukraine side, if you're helping the non-government control areas, you could be considered as supporter of the terrorists. So even for local organizations registered in Ukraine is a challenge if they decide to support the people on the non-government control areas. And for diaspora organizations, Ukrainian, it's a double challenge because first they need to allocate money for Ukraine and then somehow find partners in non-government control areas. So I would say this is like both sides, and two points is that kind of a patriotism, but also these legal restrictions and also different banking system even working in the non-government control areas because they are separated from the whole world. They have links only with Russian banking system, meaning they're cut from the overall banking system, and it's also a challenge. Maybe Lois would add something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just for Ukraine, I would say as well that we do think it's possible that in the non-government controlled areas that Russian diaspora organizations are providing support, but within the time frame and the capacity of this research, we couldn't find any concrete evidence of that. But certainly, it's there's a potential that kind of humanitarian support is going into the non-government controlled area. Over.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Raphael, do we have more questions?
I think we had maybe a question on collaboration and coordination between diaspora organizations, institutional humanitarian actor. How, like, a little bit based on the finding of the case studies. Is there any recommendation for because we see that in Ukraine there is not a very strong, at the moment there is very little synergies and very little communication between the institutional humanitarian actors and the diaspora organization. Is there any recommendation and based on the finding of the case study on how to strengthen and create synergies between the two groups?
Sure, thank you. That's actually a very timely question because speaking to diaspora organizations, we found out that some of them have a period when they review their strategical focus because they have been supporting Ukraine, like providing humanitarian assistance for 7 years now. And now they're looking for some other areas where they can be helpful. And I think that sharing strategic information like humanitarian response plans and everything that is connected to the needs would be very great, and this would help them to plan long term. It's the first thing. And the second thing is that, and this is particularly for Ukraine, some organizations located in the US, for example, they proved to be quite successful in terms of advocacy during the 2013 and 2014. And it would be great to find some way to coordinate and cooperate with them in terms of advocacy, because they have this ability and they have the resource and they have the knowledge. But the third one is actually coming from the second, is that most, like 99% of Ukrainian diaspora organizations representatives, they don't have any institutional support. They don't work in these organizations. They work elsewhere full time, meaning they have no time to fundraise and plan properly long term. They lack institutional support. But for example, even if we talk about advocacy, they cannot apply for any grants, for example, related to Ukraine, because they are located in US. So maybe thinking about expanding the criteria for organizations applying for institutional support or project-based support would actually help them to contribute to this work, like that.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. So yes, I think on both sides there are areas of and way to make some step and some improvement to strengthen the coordination. Also some area, as you were saying, in country of residence, when we see that several diaspora organizations are quite strong and could coordinate together to focus on the country of origin and operation. Great. I think that's our last question for Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, Alexandra. Oh, unless there is a new question coming up. Maybe it's, I think the last question is on Pakistan, so maybe we could ask it at the end on the last Q&A session.
Yeah, I think we can move then to maybe Somalia. We can come definitely back to Pakistan or more overall questions. There have been a few overall questions in the chat also for DEMAC, so we'll take them at the end. And maybe move to Somalia first to have also that presentation. And the researcher who supported on that was Guhat Adan. He's been working in different regions of Somalia since the early 1990s, so many years, and has long-term experience in humanitarian and development programming, and has been involved and is currently involved in a number of research studies also for Tufts University. And a key expert consultant on the facilitation of social transfers in Somalia and supporting the Somali government in development planning. So thanks a lot for being with us today, Guhat, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And presenting on behalf of Somalia and presenting on what we did in Somalia. To start with, Somalia is a country that has been affected by over 3 decades of internal conflicts and natural disasters. And the worst disasters that have been experienced in Somalia being the 1992, 2011, and the latest 2017, which was one that was close to famine that was averted. And Somalia has a large diaspora of communities in Europe, US, Middle East, and other parts of the country. And the diaspora organizations or the diaspora support in Somalia is is a life-saving for many Somalis, especially during the crisis. And before I get into the presentation, I want to make one thing clear. That is diaspora organization. When we say diaspora in Somalia, they are the diaspora organization, which are the formal diaspora organization, and the diasporas which are much in one way or the other support into the humanitarian response, but does not belong to any organization. So it's part of the communities that contribute into the diaspora, the diaspora organization. Coming to the presentation, and some of the things that we found in Somalia is that the diaspora organizations in Somalia are not working in isolation. They are working with the communities. As has been mentioned in the earlier presentations, they are very close to the community. And one thing that gives them strength is that Somalia is by default a socially connected community. And whether those in the country and those in the diaspora, the communities or members of the communities remain connected. Then in that case, the diaspora organizations implement their programs or their interventions, whether they are present in Somalia or not, they are capable of implementing programs as they want to implement it, because they are able to partner with business and religious leaders, community leaders, and different parts of the society to implement their programs. Somali diaspora organizations have structures, some of them have offices in their country of residence and office structures and operational system in their country of residence. Some of them have inside Somalia as well as in their country of origin, in their country of residence. What does that one mean? For those who have structures or operational system in both the country of residence as well as the country of origin, they are able to implement directly. They are able to implement programs directly. And when they implement directly, they use both the funds they mobilized from the diaspora communities in where they live, as well as sourcing other resources from international organizations international organizations, including NGOs and UN agencies. For those who don't have presence or operational structures in Somalia, they work with the local organizations as partners, as well as those whom we mentioned earlier, who are directly implementing through the community system. The difference between the two, there's a slight difference between the two. And this is, the latter one is a more of a formal organization, formal diaspora organization that want to see some form of protocols and procedures being followed. While the earlier one, for example, those who are working through the communities and the religious leaders and community leaders and business leaders are more of informal by virtue of being triggered by the crisis. They mobilize resources, and because they don't have the structures, they just form groups and mobilize resources and send to the eminent community leaders. And another important thing that was found is different levels of humanitarian coordination. And as mentioned in the earlier slides or earlier presentations, there exist different levels of coordinations. The coordinations between, for example, those informal diaspora groups, those are the ones with a zero coordination. They coordinate with nobody. And they are the majority in terms of responding to the crisis. But they coordinate with any institutional humanitarian system. However, the organizations that have formal structures and want to see themselves as professional organizations normally coordinate with the humanitarian institutions or with the humanitarian system in the country, either directly, those who are directly present in the country, or through their local partners, those who are working with the local humanitarian actors. And for example, there are some organizations in some European countries like Finland and UK. For example, in Finland, there is an umbrella organization called FinSom. Over 30 diaspora organizations are united under this umbrella and working together by either directly working in Somalia themselves or working through local organizations. And the good part of it is that the Finnish government is supporting this umbrella with a secretariat that is supporting them with all the things that they might not be able to provide to access government funds, and they are able to source some fund, however little it is. They are given some resources by the government to implement project in Somalia. And most of these organizations, they are paired in either 3, 5, 7 diaspora organizations and work in different regions in Somalia through different local organizations. What does that one tell you? It tells you as much as they are given the capacity to resource fund, manage funds, and trickle down to Somalia and implement projects in Somalia, they are able again to support the local organizations, the local NGOs inside Somalia to work together hand in hand. Next slide, please. Most diaspora organizations identified have a formal setup. I think this one is some of the things I have already mentioned. And those who are formal organizations and registered as charity organizations in the country of residence have a lot of volunteers who are either working in Somalia or in the country of residence. In most cases, when there are crises, what they do that they not only mobilize resources, but financial resources, but they also mobilize human resources to come to Somalia and implement projects directly. And this was evident in Somalia in 2011 and 2017, where many Somali diaspora organizations mobilized the volunteers, especially those who are in the universities or who have just finished their studies to get some experience. I think they realized Somalia was the best place maybe to come and work and gain experience. Once they were mobilized, they were able to come and work directly, implement programs. And having said that, most of, in Somalia, the regions, the balance of humanitarian, diaspora organizations is not that balanced. There are some regions with more humanitarian diaspora organizations, while others have lesser diaspora organization. And this has something to do with the historical and structural systems, imbalanced systems that has been there in Somalia. And looking at the graph, for example, because Somalia was a scene of crisis, humanitarian crisis on and off, much of the diaspora responses are humanitarian, like food security and livelihood. These are, when we say food security, most of the food security that is provided by diaspora organizations are humanitarian crisis, that is emergency food security responses, either in form of cash or in kind. And of late, what happens is that they not only send money and or maybe food to Somalia, but through their partners, either the communities, the community system, or the local NGOs, they recruit or they recruit their beneficiaries. And once they get the list of the beneficiaries, they even don't need to send the money in bulk. What they need to do is using the Hawala system or the money transfer system that is very strong in Somalia and is working all over the world. They take the list to these money transfer companies, and individuals get direct transfers from the diaspora organizations, which is more efficient and sometimes in terms of even transparency and making sure that the money that they send is being received by the people that were meant to receive. And equally, gender diversity and inclusion, 11%. 11%. And there are some organizations, diaspora organizations, which are supporting not only humanitarian, but also development. When we say development, it's not the one-off or the during crisis education, but there are some organizations that are supporting education system or providing health equipment, not health service per se, but health equipments to hospitals and schools and different institutions in different parts of the country. And these have been ongoing from, let's say, early 2000, after many Somali diaspora settled in the country of residence. Then they started thinking of how to support their people, their communities back home. And then they thought the most important way to support them is through education. Then the other part is WASH, which is more of, again, both humanitarian and development. There are some organizations, diaspora organizations, trying to drill boreholes in the epicenter of droughts so that they stop displacement as a result of water shortages, and to contain or retain the communities in the rural areas. Because if people have access to water, then displacement might be lesser as opposed to when they don't have water. Economic development and income generation.
Sorry to interrupt you, Guhad. Maybe in the interest of time, you could quickly also have a look at maybe highlighting the 2 examples you find most outstanding we have found, and then wrap up. So we have also, there's a couple of questions already, so I would like to have time for those as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Just to mention, for example, a diaspora organization called Ganana Organization has been supporting education since early, supporting education since early 2000 in parts of Gedo, and many people have graduated from their schools and joining both national and international universities. And again, coming to the aspect of humanitarian, and I start with the right-left corner, and Southwest Research and Development Center in Bai, Bakol, and part of Gedo have drilled several boreholes, I think 6 boreholes in 6 different villages. And these villages were the epicenter of displacement, especially during droughts. So they have been doing this since 2019, 2020, and I think they did the last one early 2021 in one part of Gedo. And HIRDA is a diaspora organization, and it has structures both in Europe and in Somalia, and is partnering with UNICEF, running over 20 MCHs. Again, every time there is a crisis, the the diaspora group, part of it, mobilize resources and respond to the crisis, especially in Gedo. And Ghanana, as just mentioned, but I mentioned I want to go back to the education system that they are running in Gedo, and a forestation program they are running in Lower Juba, but also in the recent water shortages because of the longer dry spell in Gedo. They have been running water tracking in different parts of Gedo. And in 2019, Arladi Aid provided food and mosquito nets to over 750 flood affected households in Afgoye district, Lower Shabelle. And most of the time, Arladi Aid respond into crisis in southwest region of Somalia. SSPDO supported over 600 households of flood affected with cash and hygiene promotion kits in Beledweyne. You remember the 2019-2020 floods in Beledweyne. And in February 2019, Rajo is another diaspora organization, supported over 1,000 drought-affected households in central Somalia with 1 month food aid.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I have to stop you there, Guhad. We have a couple of really interesting questions, and I think this really gave us a fair impression of how diverse the response from Somali NGOs is and how much you really have found in the research. So thank you very, very much for that. And I would actually directly start with one question and come back to a point you have highlighted and mentioned, the Finnish Somali diaspora network in Finland, supported by the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. And I think that's really an interesting aspect that came out in the research and a key example of how coordination in countries of residence can work. So I was interested if you could maybe highlight 1 or 2 points that how did this coordination in the countries of residence come into existence, and what are really the advantages the diaspora organizations have named that they have from this? What were the strong points they gained?
Very good. And in Finland, the respondents in Finland mentioned that initially different diaspora organizations were approaching the government and were asking for support. Then there were many of them who were coming to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for support. And then what they did is that the government asked, now, can you all come together and form an umbrella or form an organization, the Finnish SOM network? And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came in, supported them with a secretariat that will support all these organizations. Initially, there were 30 and almost 3 to 5 organizations come on board again. Now that is how they are working inside the country, and they are jointly approaching the Ministry of Foreign Affairs asking for support, either in terms of technical support inside the country or financial support in Somalia to implement programs. And just to mention it, most of their programs are more of development than humanitarian to start with. And because they don't have a lot of presence in Somalia, they were allowed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to partner with the local NGOs in Somalia, and they quarterly have meetings and discussions between both the diaspora organization and the local organization. They either come in one region, they always at any one time come into one region of Somalia and meet all those who are active, who are running active programs in Somalia. And they are coordinating both inside Somalia and in Finland. Again, the same point with the coordination, their partners coordinate with the country coordination system.
That's a super interesting example, Guhad. Thank you so much. And it's really insightful. And maybe something we'll need to maybe use as a example for other countries and other diaspora organizations. We have some very interesting questions in the chat, and there's one from Sasha who is asking about clans and ethnic groups. We know that Somalia is divided by clans and ethnic groups, and Sasha was wondering if this is something we see as well in terms of diaspora organization. Are they incentivized by clan as well? And when they respond, is it also something that you see in the selection of beneficiaries and area of intervention?
Very good. I think the same question relates to what has been said earlier in form of politicizing aid, for example. But coming directly to the question, those who are working through the community system, to hit the nail on the head, is more of clan-based. The communities that they are working, the communities that they are connected to are the communities that they came from, for example. So they are working for those who are coming from, for example, from Puntland, the diasporas that are coming from Puntland, they will directly work with the communities in Puntland. And the same who are coming from Jubaland, and the same those who are coming from Southwest. For example, when the organization that I mentioned, Southwest Research and Development, the name tells you that they are diaspora group, that is the diaspora organization. The diaspora themselves are from Southwest region, and that is where they focus. So in terms of clan-based, those who are working through the communities, they are more focused on the clan area, their clan regional area, geographical area. Those who are more of formal and professionalizing it, they are looking not from the clan level to the regional level. However, there are some which are going more than that, beyond that, and responding to crisis in different places. For example, Hirda, for example, is responding to crisis in Gedo, responding crisis into Puntland, responding to crisis into Somaliland, and responded crisis into Baidoa. So it's like some of them have gone beyond the region and beyond the clan-based system, to say the least. And I think this is because of maturity. And organizations who are at nascent stage, they focus on the regional or district of origin inside Somalia, and then gradually grow like that. So it's a matter of maturity and growth.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Guhad. And also one thing you did mention in the case study is when there's a large crisis coming up, then we see that all diaspora organizations are mobilizing, regardless of if it's regardless of the clan or the region. But like for one of the major droughts in Somalia, we saw that pretty much every diaspora organization was supporting. Actually, it leads to my next question, which is related to the COVID situation and the ongoing big crisis that Somalia is facing. We saw about 3 weeks ago that a Global Somali Diaspora organized an international summit to mobilize the diaspora community all around the world on this crisis of COVID, and also the combination with the drought. So it would be interesting to hear in the case study, this is something that you've been witnessing our diaspora organization mobilizing to respond to the COVID situation, and if so, how are they doing it?
Good. Just before I get to the later question, the previous question, for example, the 2011, 2017 droughts, and normally when the crises are regional based and have not escalated to catch the international media, the regional based diaspora tend to respond more than the global Somali diaspora. But when the crisis becomes large and or goes out of hand, whether it is in one region or two regions, all the Somali diaspora tend to respond in solidarity, so that when tomorrow the other group has to respond to the other side, they also have the same response. Coming to the recent crisis, not only the COVID-19 response, the COVID-19 crisis, and maybe the close to drought, long dry spell, there was also the Gata cyclone on the northern part. So in terms of response, yes, the diaspora has responded, especially to the Gata cyclone, although it was not very big as it used to be. And the diaspora, so the Somali diaspora community has mobilized all over the world and formed a forum for the diaspora, the global Somali diaspora. But it seems the pandemic has also affected them in where they are. And their response is not coming the way it used to be. Their response is not felt the way it used to be felt in the previous crisis. So as much as they are being mobilized, I think they are better off than Somalia at the moment, but they also have their own problem in their country of residence at the moment. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And I think you raise a very important point of the mobilization of funding, which where we see the diaspora was also affecting in their country of residence by the COVID situation, and therefore mobilization of funding was much more difficult for this problem.
Can I?
Yeah, maybe.
Can I maybe? I don't know if it is going to be asked, but there was a question that was asked previously about areas controlled by insurgency.
Yeah, we replied to this one on the Ukraine case. On the Ukraine with Dina, Lois did mention this question. So actually, we are moving to the last Q&A session. So I will let Alexandra mention this, where we will ask all the remaining questions that we have in the chat. This is a more general Q&A. Alexandra.
Thanks. Maybe we will not get to all of them because there are quite some, but we'll try. And I think one that already has been partly answered, but I would like to bring back to the chat was on Pakistan. That Alison was interested if knowing that international organizations have difficulties in registering and working within Pakistan, whether that also is a challenge for diaspora organizations that are based in other countries but operating in Pakistan. And I think Nilofer, maybe you can quickly elaborate and highlight what challenges or also what commonalities do diasporas face there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. So overall, this shrinking space is an issue for all the civil society, NGOs, LNGOs, and international organizations. So they have to pass through a very cumbersome and daunting process of completing the documentation and getting clearance from different state institutes, state departments. So I would say that it's slightly easy for national organization to work in the country, but it's very difficult. I mean, it's not as much difficult as it is for in the international community, but still it's not easy. And we are, and another thing is that like this with shrinking space, the donor community is moving. And so that's another reason even that that even if some of the NGOs are registered and they are allowed to work, but still they cannot sort of like implement the activities. And that is the true for the diaspora organization who have partners over there. They have to pass through the strict process. And recently I was talking to one of the diaspora organization with the name of Pani, which is not covered in this mapping though. And they were expressing the efforts they inserted to like sort of registered here and work, and then they end up like working with their own their previous implementing partners instead of like they were not allowed to work. So the picture is either not very rosy for the LNGOs as well, though the government is determined and they are aiming that they are sort of like simplifying the processes, but still it's taking a lot of time. And it's not only about like the first step is their registration and getting NOC, but also getting NOC from different levels, like the local government and then the district governments and stuff like that. So,
thank you. Thanks a lot. I hope, Alison, that answered your question. And then from Abdirrahman, we also had one that I would maybe like to globally raise to Glenn or Lois. That was a question on how long do diaspora organizations operate on the ground and the motives of support. We have heard from the different countries a little bit on the motivations, but globally speaking, what do you see for how long do they operate? And also, is it a consistent support, or do they disintegrate after an emergency intervention? So what would you see there as a conclusion?
Yeah, I can answer on behalf of the team. No, I think certainly what we see is the motivation. There is the first motivation, I think, which is common to all, which is this affinity and their origins in the country of origin. So this is clearly the first number one motivation. So they're certainly mobilized by, you know, the what they see the suffering back in their countries of origin. That's clear. And then there's different motivations from there. I think in terms of like how long do they stay and how long do they actually carry out their humanitarian response, it's a good question. I think overall, what you see is that, yes, some organizations, diaspora organizations, many of them sort of go in and out of humanitarian response, as quite often in all of the three contexts. Often they are active in what we would say more development, more, not even development, but more longer term support to communities. That can be very local or it can be very global, like in Pakistan running education programs, or in Somalia helping, you know, individual hospitals, for example. And so what tends to happen is that, yes, they're less involved in what you would say is more longer term projects or programs. They do tend to really react to meet the immediate needs. There are, of course, examples seen where that's not the case. For example, long-term support for health clinics, as Gu had said, in Somalia. Thanks, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That's really interesting points. I see that there are many questions also from Keiko. I'm not sure I can ask all of them, but maybe I will pick one on regarding the country of residence. Keiko would be interested to hear from you how you identify DOs in their country of residence. Do they have humanitarian intervention in their country of residence and not only in the country of origin or operation? And do they also manage to access funding from donors in their country? And if not, is there any recommendation on them to improve that?
Thanks, sir. I can continue on that one too. No, in fact, one thing that is, for example, you see, for example, with some of the Pakistani diaspora organizations, is they are actually active, and also the Somalia and the Ukrainian ones, actually, they're all active in their countries of residence, often supporting their own nationals. For example, you know, supporting Pakistanis abroad in their countries of residence that, for example, fall into trouble or in vulnerable situations. So they are often doing that, and some of them are actually started off like the Ukrainian organizations to actually promote Ukrainian culture outside of Ukraine. So they have been doing this work for many years, if not decades, for some of them. So there is that notion that they do have some support. They are sometimes supporting and have programs, but often targeted towards you know, also people, not the broad community, but for example, you know, people of Ukrainian origin in the US, or people of Pakistani origin in Australia. And then the other point on funding, yes, that some of them organizations are increasingly accessing funding. The example of in Finland. Also, we've seen examples of diaspora organizations in the US accessing US government funding, but also private companies, for example. So you do have examples of that where, as Lois mentioned at the very start, the majority of funding is coming from individual diaspora in the countries of residence. But this is being also supplemented by what we would call traditional institutional donor funding. Thanks, Rafael.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I think we have one more point that I'd like to come back to, and I don't know if Lois or Guhad. Lois, you answered before with Dina on Ukraine on the areas of insurgencies and in Ukraine case, non-government controlled areas, but also in the case of Somalia, actually, I think it's a quite interesting case study. So maybe if you quickly could give a comment on that side as well. I don't know if Guhad or Lois, both of you maybe have a sentence on that.
Let me take that one.
Please
let me take that one. Yeah, in the Al-Shabaab control areas, mostly as we mentioned earlier, the Somali diaspora operate through most of them operate through the community system. And when the community system, they operate through the community system and provide support through the community structures, including the clan leaders, religious leaders, then the Al-Shabaab, one, they might not know where the resources are coming. And if they know, if it is through the community system, then they will have no problem. So that gives them the leeway to operate in or to help people in the Al-Shabaab control areas. And the government does not have any, any control of that one, because one, they might not know, because the diaspora send resources from outside the country, and it may not pass through the government control area. Two, and even if the government has something and the Al-Shabaab control area are represented by the government and they know that these people need assistance and the conventional humanitarian organizations are not able to reach there. And if they see that the diaspora organization are able to support them, then they will also be supporting them for the government not to harm, not to either stop or harm them. Over.
Thank you very much, Guhad. That's really insightful. Great. I think we are reaching to the end of our online conference, so we will wrap up and highlight to be the next step for DEMAC and for all of us. There are some questions that we have not been able to address today. I'm really sorry. I see that Keiko and Paul, there's one or two questions that we didn't come back to you on, but we can come back to you bilaterally or via our social media. We'll make sure to answer to your questions. So I will be in touch. Don't worry about that. So a quick word. I think it was a very interesting conference. I mean, on our side, I hope you enjoyed it as well. We try to make it as interactive as possible with a lot of questions and discussion with the different researchers and consultants. And thank you to all of you for your participation. On the next step, we have the actual case studies and the report will be shared early June. They are currently being finalized, especially on the layout and the editing. And then we have a series of workshops. I won't go through all of them because we are running out of time. But if you are a Somali DO, a Pakistani DO, or a Ukrainian DO, or if you work in one of these three countries and you're interested in taking part in this workshop, please reach out to us. You can find our contact details on our social media page or on our website. And again, I would like to thank all the participants. Please follow us on our social media. We have a very active Facebook and Twitter page. We post every week information about Diaspora Organization, about events. So if you want to stay connected, please do so. I don't know if Alexandra, you wanted to also say a last word?
No, only adding thank you all very, very much. And we will indeed share the PowerPoint slides with all of you as a follow-up. So because I just see that question came up. So if you have signed up for the event, you will receive an email as a follow-up with the PowerPoint slides, no problem. Thank you all for raising questions, participating, and staying with us throughout the webinar. So thanks a lot and have a nice day, evening, night in some areas of the world.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.